My name is Jerry Howard. I'm the trustee of the library, and I really thank you all for coming out to this author circle event with David Denby, who a friend. I'm really pleased to say, and his really terrific and timely book, Eminent Jews. A couple of brief introductions. David is a longtime film critic for the New Yorker. He's criticized a lot of other things for a lot of other places. He's nothing if not critical. He is the author of a number of books, most conspicuously Great Books, which is his participant observer account of the fate of the liberal arts in higher education, and I think it's rounding out into classics status at this point. Anyway, we'll be talking about Eminent Jews. We're very lucky to have, again, as David's interlocutor, use a big word, Katie Rosman. She's an author herself with a memoir, If You Knew Susie, a memoir of her mother. She is an employee reporter for the New York Times, currently covering what seems to me to be the most difficult beat on in the metro part of the Times for the Jewish community, plus the protest culture post October 7th, which seems to me to be, well, life's a minefield, isn't it? Anyway, she will be our lead interviewer. I'll be over here because for two reasons, because I didn't want to deny myself the pleasure of being in conversation a bit with David, and plus I feel these matters can really benefit from the Irish Catholic perspective. So with that said, Katie, take it away.
Okay, good. So
here you go.
Oh,
And the microphone is yours.
this is on. All right. Hi. Thank you all for coming out. I'm so honored to get to talk to an author and critic who I've read and have not had the pleasure to meet in person. And this as a not that eminent Jew myself, I really enjoyed this book. And it's, you think you know a lot about people who are cultural icons, and sometimes, there's just sort of cliches that hang out in the popular culture, and reading this book really brought a lot home to me. So before I ask you a couple specific questions about the book, I wanted to ask you about the idea of cultural Judaism. And obviously it's, a huge theme in the book, and a huge theme in life in New York City, I think. And I'm curious why there is such a phenomenon as cultural Judaism. Is there culture? I mean, you don't hear much about cultural Christianity or, cultural Catholicism, culture, you don't hear about that connected to other religions. How would you explain where can you, I don't know, can you address that?
Well, it seems to go back to certain character formations that existed in the diaspora, which was to read as much as possible, to learn as much as possible. There were physically defenseless people, no army, no state to protect them. This incredible book, the Old Testament and all of its commentaries that were attached to it, was essential part of holding together and being a kind of nation without a nation. And the insistence on study, which had an extraordinarily high prestige for men, the yeshiva booker, the young man who, despite spending his days in darkened room with tallow candles, poring over text, was nevertheless prime marital bait for some of the more attractive young women in the community. It was quite extraordinary. I don't know if there's any other community that for which that could be said to be true. Boy, was Norman Mailer willing to get out of that
Yeah.
idea. There was the nice Jewish boy, and the good Jewish boy, and he invented the bad Jewish boy.
Yeah.
For sure. But it gets transformed into the United States, I think, into a more practical sense. We're getting away from religious study, religious texts. We have to master a new country, new culture. The insistence on learning English in Irving Howe's book, World of Our Fathers, marvelous book, about the Eastern Jews who landed in New York between 1881 and 1920 or so, when immigration started to tail off, and became just a series of quotas. The amount of obsession with learning the language, reading the country's literature, and these were not all intellectuals; these were working men, and partly there's a Russian influence here, where it would not be considered unusual for a guy who worked in a sweatshop to read Tolstoy on Sunday. It was or to insist that his son learn to play the violin. It was always there, and then among an intellectual class who became the New York intellectuals, the children of immigrants, they wanted to master everything, all the texts that made one a modern person as quickly as possible. And it was, in many cases, they did it on their own, not just from going to City College. So in many ways, it was as important to them as religion was to be a literate person, in particular literacy. And I mean, it has continued, and I'm not a religious person myself, but I feel a kind of kinship with Jews in different parts of the world, and I think it's basically not just political but cultural.
And how did the humor and that specific type of intellectualism, which I at least think of as sort of louder, rooted in activism, banter, dinner table, sort of political arguments, not necessarily like polite, Ivy League discourse. How did that sort of Jewish humor and intellectualism disseminate? It became a lot of what we think of as, New Yorkiness can actually be tied back to attributes of, Jewish family, Jewish cultural. How'd that spread? Was it just Seinfeld?
Let me tell you a story about Mel. Mel Brooks was walking across 57th Street. I don't know, 1955, 1956. He was working for Sid Caesar. If I can do a self-plug here, I have a review in this week's New Yorker of a brand new big biography of Sid Caesar by David Margolick. Very good book. Anyway, Mel was a kid. He was Sid's protege. And there he was walking across 57th, and Larry Gelbart, another writer for Sid, later wrote Tootsie and the TV version of MASH, was on his left, and Neil Simon, unknown at that point, was on his right. And three nuns were approaching across 57th Street. And Gelbart said, "No, Mel, no." What are you talking? I don't understand. And Neil Simon said, "Will you get hold of yourself?" I don't understand. No, nothing. What? so the three sketch writers keep moving forward, and the nuns come towards them, and Mel leaps out at them and says, "Take off those costumes. The nuns' sketch is out." Well, how did they react? I said to him, and he said they hit the ground. Now,
You know, that was my first grade teacher. She told me about that.
well, he's told it many times, but I think he freshened it up a little bit for me when I talked to him. A second anecdote, a little bit more respectable. Leonard Bernstein was conducting the Vienna Philharmonic in Vienna in the Große Musikvereinssaal, rehearsing the Mahler Fifth Symphony in 1972. It was not his first time with Vienna Philharmonic. He had been there in '66, had been a great success, and several times after. And then coming up to '72, he's doing one of the late Mahler symphonies, Symphony Number 5. And a little backstory here: Mahler, of course, was Jewish. He was a Bohemian Jew who converted to Catholicism in order to take over the state opera in Vienna, which was a state position, and the Philharmonic, 1897 to 1907. His music was banned during the Anschluss. After the Anschluss, 1938 to 1945, the Jews in the orchestra were thrown out, humiliated, died in many cases. He knew all this very, very intimately. Anyway, coming forward to 1972, he's conducting the Fifth Symphony and rehearsing the first movement. And those of you who know that piece know there's an excruciating climax, I would say, of despair near the end of the first movement, and they were holding back. And he was shocked. You can watch this. Just go on YouTube and put in Leonard Bernstein rehearsing Mahler. And he lost his temper, which is something Leonard Bernstein never did. He made love to orchestras. He cajoled, he flirted, he taught, but he very rarely got angry. And he got angry because this was their music. I mean, now consider the situation. This is a boy from suburban Boston, who didn't even start playing the piano, and he didn't even have a piano until he was 10. And it was obviously a genius, and became this extraordinary all-purpose musician. And he was determined to prove to Europe explicitly that American musical culture was there, that it had attained a kind of equality, at least at the level of reproducing great music. And so he was shocked. He was hearing from within the ranks, he later said, Scheiß Musik, crap music, is Jewish music. So here, and he was teaching them how to play their own music. So I could give you an example with Betty. Friedan, whose first book, Feminine Mystique, sold about 60,000 copies, which is actually quite good.
Yes.
In 1963. But she was dissatisfied with a fellow named
George Brockway.
George Brockway at Norton, which then and now is a distinguished publisher of mainly nonfiction.
A little too distinguished.
A little too distinguished. She may have had a beef with him because Brockway had 13 children, and she may have, wondered what Brockway had put his wife through. Anyway, it sold 1,300,000 copies in trade paperback in the next year or two. And Brockway called her in and said, let's talk about your next book, Betty. And she said, George, you're not going to get my next book. You made me feel like such a Jew for trying to sell the Feminine Mystique. And then she used the profanity, which means get lost, only in slightly more pungent terms. Now, what is the point of these anecdotes? Not that Jews need to speak rudely to Gentiles in order to attain virtue, certainly not. The point is that they didn't expect to be punished. They did not expect to be punished. And if you read Jewish history and read about the diaspora, there were certainly semi-comfortable times in England and Spain, in France after Napoleon emancipates the Jews, and in London and Paris and Berlin and Budapest and Vienna in late mid-century 19th century, it was possible to have a professional career like Freud's, but it was always, you had to answer to so many regulations. You were there on sufferance. You were there on sufferance. And until Israel and the United States, the Jews, wherever they existed, were there on sufferance. And so now come forward to after the Second World War, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s. It really diminishes after the Second World War, in part because of Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, because of the horror of the Holocaust. The evidence clear enough that Jews as an economic group were doing very well in this country, not in traditional industries like oil and steel and chemicals and so on, but in all kinds of professions and businesses, into intellectual life, in entertainment, and so on. They felt a kind of confidence. And so I chose these four because I thought they were representative, and also they were born after the First World War and emerged after the Second World War. And as well as their own gifts, were able to draw on new media, namely the long-playing record, 1948. You can't imagine Leonard Bernstein's career without the long-playing record. Television.
Or Betty Friedan's without the paperback.
Or Betty Friedan's without mass market paperbacks. Television. And you know, they took to television disastrously in Norman Mailer's case. He was too excited, too intellectual, too hot, too laborious to function on television well, as against, say, Truman Capote, or
Gore Vidal.
Gore Vidal. So
let me break in here and
Yeah.
So before you tell us a little bit more, I've questions about each of the people you've written about, but what was the process of choosing them, and who ended up on the cutting room floor? Who are the not quite ready for?
Well, because of that frame I wanted to set up, I'd set up this perhaps arbitrary frame, born after the First World War, emerge after the Second World War by means of new media as well as their own gifts. So I ruled out Saul Bellow, who was older, and Philip Roth, who was a little younger. There is the great physicist Richard Feynman, about whom James Glick wrote an extraordinary biography called Genius. And since I know nothing about physics, I thought I better steer away from that. I briefly thought about my own mentor, Pauline Kael, great movie critic, who fits the time period. I had written about her in the New Yorker and about my relation to her and so on. And everyone said to me, enough already. Let that one go. I mean, I thought about Grace Paley, but I thought she wasn't quite well known enough. So that was pretty much it. I mean, we could have done Sid Caesar, who's a little bit older, but I'm now very glad the way it worked out. And as I said, David Margolick has written a splendid book on Caesar, which is just being published. So that was it. And I wanted to stretch the notion of eminence. The title is a joke. I mean, there was a book by Lytton Strachey, part of the Bloomsbury Circle, called Eminent Victorians, which was a wicked book. It was a kind of attack on Victorian hypocrisy, including Florence Nightingale, people who pretended to be earnestly doing good things for the world, and at the same time were terribly interested in power. These four were not hypocrites. There's no distinction between what Norman Mailer said to himself and to other than what he said and wrote in public. And Mel, it's all of a piece. So I wanted to get away from I don't know how else to put it, the lure of Jewish respectability. I didn't want to write about, Jonas Salk, great as he is, or Judge Brandeis. I wanted to write about people who were, I guess, closer to show business.
Accessible to the public.
But yeah, more understandable and to the public, easier to read. And the four of them are really rakish a bit, and had a kind of way of rebelling against the values, the mores of the previous generation, of the first generation of Jewish immigrants and their children in many cases. And I think that's the heart of it. So if you want, I will say what I mean by that. They're all Eastern European Jewish families. And there were certain values in common. These are generalizations, of course. Certainly it's all obvious. They believed in hard work. They believed that you should learn a trade. They believed in business, as well as intellectual life. Particularly the boys at first, but then the women also. Jewish women went to college in higher proportions than Christian women in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Not nearly as high as now, where women in general outnumber men in undergraduate colleges 60-40, unbelievable. An abhorrence of drunkenness. Philip Roth said the reason the Jews have been successful in the United States for the last 40 years is that they went to bed sober. I don't know about that, but Philip Roth said it. It's interesting. My very gentle parents would speak angrily about what they called shickers. That meant a man who was an alcoholic and was not taking care of his family. It's a very common trope around the house. They loathed violence in general because they had been they were in many cases defenseless throughout history. When someone came into Norman Mailer's parties and started a fight, he would fight him and either win or lose, but he would not call a lawyer. So the response of these four, and I don't mean that they articulated it this way, I'm articulating it for them. Mailer was a middle-class Jewish boy who made model airplanes and was the neighborhood darling of his mother, his aunt, and other women in the neighborhood. In the summers, he was given a room at one of his aunt's resorts on the Jersey coast, and he would sit there and write, starting when he was 15. When he was at Harvard, he went to Harvard very young and was within the Jewish middle-class student body at Harvard until the end of his sophomore year, and then he broke out. His first novel, The Naked and the Dead, which is probably still considered the best World War II novel, has an extraordinary sequence of maybe 150 pages of two guys carrying a buddy who's wounded out of the jungle. It's set during the Pacific Campaign near the end of the war. The unit is under General MacArthur's command, and they're retaking the Philippines and so on. But this is in a jungle island, and they reach an extent of physical exhaustion, somewhere between exhaustion and death, in carrying their friend out, that I don't think has ever been realized in fiction in quite that intensity. Mailer wanted to push the body as far as it go. He had a heroic conception of his own nature, the axes on which he plotted, his behavior would be courage and shame as much as a Greek warrior. If he had an impulse from the depths, a dream or a sentence that he abandoned, he thought he should, rather than bury it or take it on the couch to see, what infantile experience produced neurosis 40 years later. Instead, he thought he should act it out. So, which meant he put himself in danger and a lot of other people in danger in this quest. So, for him, his parents' generation had been sexually reticent. He thought in ways that were self-denying and simply frightened. That was certainly not his thing. He was married 6 times. He had 9 children. He cheated on all his wives, including the wonderful Norris Church at the end. But here's the paradox. In many ways, he was like every other Jewish upper middle class family, insisted his kids study and not do dope. And I've met them, and totally unlike Hollywood children who are generally a mess. His kids are very soulful and they're all right. They're doing interesting things. Anyway, I mean, that was, a way of rebelling against the values of the previous generation. Mel comes up out of the street, and he didn't go much to burlesque, he told me, but there is nevertheless the homegrown version of, rough house comedy, travesty, so on, that goes back to, I don't know, medieval street fairs, or maybe back to the Greeks and so on. He had to run away from the big kids or they would beat him up. And that's how he entertained. He never took school seriously. The most common image of him is running down a hallway being thwacked on the head by various teachers. His school was the Catskills. And for him, the body it was an explosion. It's effluvia, you might call it. Its juices or so on are exploding. So I mean, it's a descent of burlesque, but it's his own way of doing it.
Can I break in and ask you
Yeah.
something about the Catskills, which is, sort of local here, because we are on the way to the
Red
Catskills.
Apple Rest is.
You're close.
And
Yeah.
before the thruway was built, you couldn't get from New York City to the Catskills without being on this road, right, that we hear the traffic on. And Leonard Lauder used to tell me that he always remembered the Red Apple Rest, when he knew Tuxedo Park sort of from driving up to the Catskills. So tell us a bit about the Catskills and its importance in terms of helping to create, from Mel Brooks and others, just, an enormous amount of culture that has disseminated around the world.
Well, I think there were farms there and resorts there even as early as the end of the 19th century. It really gets going in the 1920s when a kind of caravan would come from, not just from New York, but from other eastern cities, when it got really hot, to this place where it was cooler, where there were lakes, where there were such luxuries as fresh blintzes every day, and where very pale Jewish bodies could meet other pale Jewish bodies from distant neighborhoods. I mean, if you didn't go to the Catskills, you generally married, within your neighborhood, whether that was the Lower East Side or parts of Brooklyn or the Bronx. And this was, so among other things, it was a marital factory, and a place where you ate a great deal and laughed a great deal. And so there's all kinds of comedy.
Or else.
There were all kinds of comedy, from just stand-up and to variety shows with skits. and little playlets. And Mel went up there when he was 14 for the first time. And his job was he was a pool tumbler. A tumbler is someone whose job it is to entertain, not formally, but like in between meals, or it could be on the front lawn of the guest house. And his job was to entertain to keep awake the ladies who were tended to fall asleep in between these enormous luncheons and enormous dinners. And so he would jump in the water with a Homburg and a suit of clothes on and say, "The business is terrible. I can't take it anymore." And a large Gentile person who had been hired for the occasion would jump in and fish him out when he was there. Jews didn't learn to swim in Brooklyn in the 30s. And by degrees, he did comedy, and he got to meet Sid Caesar, who was a few years older and was a saxophone player and just beginning to work into comedy. So there was all kinds of comedy, and it was nonstop, and everyone, right down to recent people like Sarah Silverman, passed through the Catskills and sometimes the Poconos, where there were a little more formal review kind of material was developed. And they wound up on American television in the 50s. Ed Sullivan show, which I'm sure some of you remember, which was our kind of national review of entertainment every Sunday night, including Elvis and the Beatles and so on and so forth. There were all of those comics were introduced into the American national consciousness. And Yiddish joking started turning up in all sorts of places in American television in the 50s and 60s. People didn't know what it meant a lot of the time, it just sounded funny. And in Sid Caesar's great shows, they did skits and parodies, and like they would do a Japanese epic, a 16-minute long episode actually, in which there would be pidgin, gibberish, Japanese, generously inflected with Yiddish. But I mean, it was both fun, it was both a knowing wink to the audience. It was a mild kind of subversion, and the parodies themselves, they made fun of Italian neo-realist movies, and many other things. And Mel wrote a lot of this. Was their way of joining high culture through parody.
I wanted to put my 2 cents in here for a second, because well, I mean, the American sense of humor is the Jewish sense of humor. It was invented up there and disseminated through various media. But when I read your book, I read it a bit from the outside, and I was reading it as a cultural text. And I remember there was a National Book Award ceremony, and Philip Roth was getting an award. And Philip Roth was nothing if not fierce about and intelligent. And he gave this extraordinary speech in which he said, "I am not a Jewish American writer. I am a Jew who writes American literature."
Right.
And he was bang like that. And so there's this terrific dialogue that is illustrated in the lives of these 4 people between Jewish culture and American culture. And the amazing thing is it's mutually enriching. It's not, there's not a lot of hostility there, but if you would speak about essentially the relationship of Jewish culture to the larger American culture, as shown in these in these 4 lives. These
It
4
is
extraordinary
remarkable
lives.
because they weren't religious. They weren't in the sense of observant. Not even Lenny, who wrote a Kaddish symphony and was obsessed with the Old Testament, and wrote a kind of a weird kind of Jewish Catholic mass.
Oh, yeah,
Very strange piece.
with hippies,
Yeah, and
guitars.
right, right. Um, uh, and Betty was not religious either until she did some study in Los Angeles, then at Brandeis in her 50s, but she felt a kind of obligation to make the most of herself, which she associated with being Jewish, and she felt guilty as hell if she wasn't working hard all the time. And I mean, whether this is associated with Judaism or not, she thought it was. She spoke of a Jewish existential conscious. Mel, the word Jew pops out of him like candy from a gumball machine. He insisted on it, putting it into your face. And particularly when a certain Methodist from the Midwest with 20 million viewers was talking to him. So on one occasion with Johnny Carson, he said, you know, this is a fraud. This is a charade. I was born 5'11", perfectly straight nose, blonde hair. And I went into Mount Sinai and they knocked the stuffings out of me. They shortened my legs. They took my voice down 2 octaves because I wanted to be a Jew comic. Now, culturally,
He was allowed to do that on television, I guess.
I try and stop it.
Yeah, wow.
But also,
Wow, that's edgy.
what I found interesting was he didn't say a Jewish comic. It's a quirk of the language. I'm sure people have written about this a great deal. That Jewish is just anodyne. It's just a descriptive term, but Jew still has the kind of quality of a brand. And that's what he was like in where Betty was growing up in Peoria. Her father was the Jew jeweler, or there was the Jew carpenter. But like
It can be pejorative or not. I
It
mean,
could be
depending on who says it in what context.
there was often more derisive, I think, than not. And Woody Allen played with that, the difference between Jew and Jew.
Jewy.
Yeah, and Annie Hall, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it still exists and is reemerging in right-wing anti-Semitism at the moment, like the guy who interviewing with Tucker Carlson,
Nick Fuente.
Nick Fuente. The Times has done a particularly good job, by the way, in analyzing all this. There've been like 3 major
Thank you.
articles. Yeah, so I think America found a kind of exuberance in Jewish comedy that it lacked in its own comics. And this goes back before these people because Eddie Cantor and Sophie Tucker and Al Jolson were on the radio in the 20s.
If I could add also that I think America broadly took to Jewish comfort with high culture too. That so many important Jewish figures have been the transmitters of the values of high culture, especially I would say in literature, but all over the place. It's a gift.
Oh, absolutely, and intellectual life and criticism and the social sciences and so on in the Broadway theater, which brings us to Mel in a way, because you all probably remember from the producers the musical number "Springtime for Hitler." Springtime for Hitler and Germany. You can sing it better than I can. I'm sure. A swishy SS officer comes down the steps singing, and there are various women scantily clad with pretzels hanging from parts of their bodies and so on. And there's and then there's a chorus. This was in The Producers, which came out in '68, I think. And it caused quite a lot of consternation. It was about 23 years after the Holocaust had ended, and Renata Adler in the Times and Pauline Kael in the New Yorker were both upset with the raucous whatever it was that he was doing. And I take Mel a little more seriously than other people, I hope, without destroying the fun. And I said to him, look, the musical comedy was essentially a Jewish creation, except for the divine called Porter, up until what, the 1980s, when the English and the French barged in. But you know, a great period, Kern, Berlin, Gershwin, many others, lesser, so on. It was essentially a Jewish creation. And the audience often for musicals was often, in the early days of a run, was New York Jewish, and then it was just, thank God, spread out to everybody else. And I said to him, will you, in this particularly sort of crazy kind of tease, Springtime for Hitler, a Hitler production number, elbowing the Jews a little bit and saying something like, you're here, you're alive, they're dead, get over it. In other words, you can't murder the Nazis, but you can stop murdering yourself. And he balked, and he said, oh, no, well, maybe. He said, maybe. It provoked him when I asked this question. And he said, I'm just a great entertainer. Mind you, that's what I am. And there partly I thought, well, there's a tradition among American popular entertainers never to make grand statements for yourself, never to make pretentious statements for yourself. That's very infra-dig. So John Ford would show up at meetings, the great director of movies in Hollywood, and say, I'm John Ford, I make Westerns. Well, yes, he did. He made Westerns, he made great movies of many other kinds also. Now, if you now come forward to History of the World Part 1, 13 years later, 13, 14 years later, 1981, Mel's spoof of outrageous, cruel behaviors throughout the ages, and most of it is lewd fun. Louis XIV at his court, and so on. And there is a very disturbing number in History of the World Part 1, and it's another musical number, and this time it's the Inquisition. And the Jews are strung up on the wall, and Mel is Torquemada, and he leads a bunch of chorus boys, all in Cossacks and so on. It's very. I was one of the stiffs who panned the movie in New York Magazine, 1981. And Mel said, yes, I know. You say, what the hell is he doing? This is a very hard thing for Jews to watch. So I pushed him again, and I said, come on now. I mean, there's a bit of an intent here, right? But there are a lot of ways of Mel Brooks being funny. But making a musical comedy number about the nuns, here we go with the nuns again, show up and strip off their habits and in white bathing suits out of what was her name, late 40s, Esther Williams aquatic musical, pull the Jews with their black hats and everything down into the water. It's very humiliating. Weren't you trying to expunge the terror and the fear with this excruciatingly aggressive comedy? And he said, this time he said, yes. Now, I don't want to put words in his mouth. After October 7th, he might not, agree to that at all. But there is, what I was trying to say was that in all of these people who code breakers, who were like changing the behavior of their parents and their grandparents, there was at the same time a kind of teacherly, almost rabbinical notion, which I associate very much with being Jewish. And with Mel, it's what I've just tried to explain. With Norman, he felt the country had fallen into a kind of spiritual torpor after the war, the McCarthy period, the Eisenhower presidency. Would that we had Eisenhower for president right now is my reaction. Anyway, and that it was his job to shake people up with his writing, with his behavior, with his public statements, and so on. Betty, of course, was, as she said, trying to rouse the sleeping beauties. Women were tremendously active in the workforce during World War II. Eleanor Roosevelt convinced her husband that there should be daycare centers next to the factories. By the way, one of the reasons Mamdani won was that one of his programs is universal daycare. Betty Friedan went to Sweden after in 1964 or 5, after Feminine Mystique was published. The Swedish feminist said, well, this is all very well, Mrs. Friedan, but without universal daycare, it's all just talk.
So if I can just, my role as timekeeper.
Uh-oh, I'm
We have
sorry.
about 6 or 7 minutes.
Yeah, let's
and
give
then
people an
we'll
opportunity.
open it up to
Well,
questions, but
why don't we can, I think we can give people an opportunity to pipe
if
in.
there are questions.
Would anyone like to know anything at all about Norman Mailer or Betty Friedan or?
Well, since you mentioned the two of them together,
Uh-huh.
I always found it, and I don't know what the explanation is, very strange that for the longest time, Norman Mailer was actually anti-women's movement, the women's liberation movement. And I guess, listen, somebody who marries 6 times probably doesn't really know how women think and function.
Yeah, and there's also, I thank you for bringing all that up, because also where you said he was anti-violence, I mean, he's accused of stabbing his wife.
Not accused of, he did.
He did it. All right,
And
but
there's a lot in the book about sort of the antipathy.
there has to
between-
be a little straightening out here. Mailer was not anti-feminist. He was friends with Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan. He believed in the policies of the National Organization for Women, this great organization that Betty started in 1966, equal pay for equal work. He came around on abortion. What he was against was radical feminism, by that which emerged in the late 60s in so much polemical writing. And in particular, to be blunt about it, he was against the expulsion of the penis from sexual pleasure. He was not in favor of that. And he wrote an extraordinary book-length article called The Prisoner of Sex that was published in its entirety in Harper's when Willie Morris was the editor of The Heroic Age of Journalism, which Jerry and I remember, when entire issues of magazines would be given up to a provocative piece. And I described it in the book as the only male chauvinist text that's worth reading, and that it's morally, that it's rhetorically magnificent and morally stupid. And for Mailer, sex, it's like Lawrence, his mentor in these, D.H. Lawrence in these matters, sex had to be elemental. It had to come up from the earth. So the earth literally had to move. Therefore, it had to be an occasion of the greatest risk. So there couldn't be any birth control. He was, just to be consistent, he was against masturbation among young men or any men, because everything that's good in you goes up in your hand, and there has to be a transformation in intercourse, and so on, and so forth. Well, this is all very grand, but it leaves men having either good or bad sex, and it leaves women with a baby and diapers to to buy, and I mean, that's why I say it's stupid. But to say that he was simply a misogynist is really not true. Now, if you want, I will.
Well, but it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, with all due respect. I mean, there's a lot that he wrote and stood for that doesn't translate in 2020. Like, he wouldn't, of everybody you wrote about, I think he would have significant problems having his career today.
Yeah, that's not on offer.
Yeah,
I mean, I was a kid in the sixties and Mailer meant so much to people of my persuasion, but he contradicted himself all over the place. He wanted to get down with the flower children, but he also believed that if you tamp down your impulses, including your violent ones, you're gonna get cancer. Well, so he's
I mean, it's funny because there's a lot actually to that probably would resonate on the internet today. But
Yeah, so that's conspiratorial in a kind of crazy.
Yeah.
In a kind of crazy way. Just to be clear, he is a great writer. His great books are Armies, The Naked and the Dead, Armies of the Night, which is the book about the sixties. It's about the March on the Pentagon in October 1967. And if you have any interest in the sixties and that tumultuous period of the war and the opposition to the Vietnam War, that is the book. And the third masterpiece is The Executioner's Song, which was about a lifetime con named Gary Gilmore, who came out of prison, immediately killed two people in a meaningless way and demanded to be shot by firing squad. Mailer was always looking for the ultimate outsider who rejected what he took to be what I call the spiritual torpor of the 50s and 60s, and these violent men. Jack Henry Abbott was another, Lee Harvey Oswald was the third, and he spent 8 months in South Central Utah, where there weren't many Jews, putting it mildly, interviewing everyone having to do with the case. And he wrote this extraordinary book, which won both the National Book Award and the National whatever. It won all the awards. And I think is in its way a kind of modest version of Mailer. He took his own voice out altogether. His political reporting on the conventions, the Kennedy Convention, the Goldwater Convention, Miami and the Siege of Chicago, is about what happened in 1968. This is all magnificent American writing, which comes in some ways so evocative, it's close to the poetry of Walt Whitman. This is not original with me.
I didn't mean to suggest that he's not obviously one of the great writers and thinkers and communicators. I'm just saying that the point that some people read him to be anti-woman in some ways isn't something just that can it is one of the many complicated I would say attributes that history remembers him with.
I
Are there other
do.
questions? Yeah. Yeah.
On a couple of songs, which person did you find the easiest and which most difficult to write about?
Lenny the easiest.
Lenny, the easiest.
He played an emotional role in my own life, and it comes back to Mahler again. And I write about this. I was a very uptight teenager, very sort of repressed, and another of the Mahler symphonies, the third, the gigantic third, which is 90 minutes long, ends with this overwhelming slow movement. Very odd to end a symphony with a slow movement, but well, like Tchaikovsky and the Pathétique does it, and it just opened me up. I was there in 1961 at a concert, and he was just in my life all the time. And I would be arguing with him in my head. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? I guess Betty was the hardest to write about because I think I could have talked to her. She had no problem talking to men. It was women was where she had problems. And you know, fights with Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem and many others. But she had to predominate in every meeting. She was aggrieved, and we could go into the reasons why she was so aggrieved. I think that so it was hard. I regard her genuinely as a heroine. With many.
Yeah, she reminds me of those, like, Emma Gold, whatever,
Gold.
Emma Goldman.
And Emma Gold.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, yes.
people like that, fire prints, a lot of fire.
Yeah.
Question I had was, I remember people like Warren Mailer talking to guys like William Buckley on TV, my dad.
Sure.
A lot of the conversations, like when you mentioned Mel saying Jew comic, seem to be these Jewish people asserting their right to be Jewish in American society, asserting their values into American society, moving from, like, writing songs about it to literally arguing about it. And I was fascinated. Naylor to me seemed like John Garfield, pugnacious as a character about everything. But he's not, that isn't specifically to me Jewish, because it's also a lot of immigrant experiences. People, a lot of the American culture. Remember the guy who started USA Today, wrote a book basically called "Screw You, I Did It Anyway."
Al Newirth, or
Yeah, the curious thing is that he got along very well with Buckley. And the one nice thing you could say about Buckley, well, you could say a number of nice things about him, was that he recognized writing talent. Buckley sort of created Joan Didion and other people who became excellent journalists, critics, and so on. Yeah, and the two of them hit it off on television. It was the one time Mailer was not bad debating was with Buckley. He was highly amused by Buckley's formal rhetoric.
It was fun to watch.
It was fun to watch.
And they
yeah.
shared a mayoral campaign together. They
Yeah,
both ran for mayor.
yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes, sir.
Kind of similar to the question that was just asked. My question was also in regards to the idea of comedy and using comedy to sort of be able to tell your story and be able to sort of tell your story without having to necessarily be beholden to critique in a way in which if you weren't using comedy, you would be. Is that something that you saw with Mel? It feels like today it's a similar reflection of what happened then, where comedy is sort of being used to sort of highlight certain societal differences.
well, satire, right,
Right.
is the vehicle of criticism.
Right. So do you think that's what I'm saying is it's how important is that then to the advancement of any culture or civilization?
It shows that the culture is healthy. And every time, South Park or Saturday Night Live goes after Donald Trump, I stand up a little taller. So, yeah, absolutely.
Or even when I was, the reason for me, it's a little bit, it's intriguing to hear you mention about Mel is that I know as a so-called Black individual, when a so-called white person makes a joke about a Black community, it's taken a different way. But when a so-called Black person says a joke about the Black experience, even though it's something that so-called Black people may not want to hear, it kind of makes you kind of have to look at it a different way. So that's what I mean about if you're saying so-called, I say so-called because I think we're all human beings. So when we identify ourselves these ways, it's sort of a way of separation. So that's why I say so-called, I don't even offend.
Yeah.
So that was the first part, and then the second question is going to say, kind of to what the gentleman asked originally, which is that like identity, as far as the individual, the identity of an individual, as opposed to the identity of a collective group, and how much so does the collective identity hold the individual identity back from furthering itself?
Well, Norman Mailer certainly thought that the Jewish identity was holding him back from whatever he was going to do.
And yeah, at the same time as he was running away from Judaism, he was running towards it. That's to me, the oddity of his life. He did actually, well, he didn't believe in the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh. He said after the Holocaust, I can't believe. So he made up his own God, an existential God who was constantly in battle with Satan. So this is kind of Jewish Manichaeism, and God was weak, and he needed men and women to aid him in this struggle, and that's why it was one reason why, apart from pride, it was necessary for Norman to be strong, to be courageous, to take risks, was to help God in this endless struggle. I mean, to me, it's nonsense, but it's self-mythicizing.
And then Mel Brooks, you were saying, would go on TV and say, I'm a Jew, was sort of, being very, sort of assertive in making that clear and saying, I'm not gonna let it hold me back, I guess.
We're coming, why don't you ask the last question, whatever, I'm sure you have a
I think
question.
you have it here.
Oh, Father Crowley, please.
One question. Would this be a correct understanding in saying that the eminent Jews were all cultural and non-religious?
Yes, even though Bernstein was obsessed with the Old Testament and wrote a Kaddish symphony and the Chichester Psalms. He was obsessed with the text of the Old Testament and this strange mass that we remembered before. I think,
But not practicing.
Yeah.
they were not observant, if that's what you mean. But I think they were Jewish to their fingertips, even when, in Mailer's case, running away from it. That's what fascinates. He actually wrote, of all things, a gospel. No one has read this book.
Oh, his Jesus book?
His Jesus book, he writes, he found the Old Testament, the New Testament was too mysterious. It was too lacking in details. Any pastor could tell him that the mysteriousness of the New Testament is one reason why it's so powerful, and but so anyway, he sat down to write in Jesus's voice. It's perfectly respectable. John Updike reviewed it in the New Yorker and said it's not very good, but it's not blasphemous in any way. It was reviewed in the New Republic by the critic James Wood, who now writes literary pieces for the New Yorker, and Mailer was up in Provincetown where he lived in the summers, and the publisher of the New Republic, a man named Marty Peretz, was coming out of a chowder house, and on the cover of the New Republic was a caricature of Mailer saying, he is done. He's a pan of this Jesus book, and Mailer punched him twice in the stomach. So he was willing to fight for his vision of, his right to write about Jesus, and this was right at the end. Another of his great books, by the way, is The Fight, which is about the rumble in the jungle, the Ali Foreman book, and it is the best book on boxing.
It's really fabulous.
And it's set in Africa, where he was completely out of his depths, and that, he was amazed by the place, and felt very awkward, and so it's a superb book. Anyway.
Well, thank you so much for coming to share all of this
A lot of big
with
ideas
us.
here.
A lot. The book, is the book on sale here?
The book is
today?
on sale.
The book is on sale. I I got my copy earlier. And I listened to the audio, which was very good. And so you can get a copy, and maybe the author would be good enough to sign your copy. We really appreciate you coming out. And David, thank you so much for coming to Tuxedo Park to share with us your incredible insight and intellect on this.
Can I just add an epilogue, which is, this is a joyous book for the most part. There's plenty of criticism of these people, as we said, Mailer assaulted his second wife, and I go into that at great length and so on, and there's outrageous behavior on the part of all of them. And the one question people have asked is, what message does this book have for this moment when Jews are in a great deal of distress for all the reasons that we know? And I can say simply, these four were afraid of nothing. And that if you can simplify to a message, the message would be not afraid. And if you are attacked as a Jew, you must answer as a Jew. Thank you.
Thank you.